like to welcome you to a new episode of The Optimistic American. This is Paul Johnson, and my guest today is a world famous author who has written a number of books. Richard, along with his wife Linda Eyre, have written books that include Teaching Our Children Joy, Teaching Our Children Responsibilities, Teaching Our Children Values. It also includes books like The Entitlement Trap. But he really has spent a lifetime, both of them have spent a lifetime giving seminars and podcasts, as well as writing books, trying to help parents deal with these major issues. Now, they've been on a lot of major shows, all the way from Oprah Winfrey to other famous shows. But what's important is, there are a lot of books on parenting. This is an author that you definitely ought to listen to, and I think you'll like his books. He has a lot good to teach us, and that's what we're going to try to focus on today. We're going to focus on how to be a better parent, on our children and the challenges that they face, the real place where power resonates from, and finally, how it is that we should focus on our marriages. Thanks for joining us, and now on to our author. Well, Richard, I'd like to welcome you to The Optimistic American. Thanks for being on our show today.
Well, thank you, Paul. I hope I am an optimistic American.
Oh, I've watched enough of your videos to know you and Linda both are optimistic Americans, maybe as optimistic as they get. So it's
Well, if I ever lose my optimism, I just look at Linda and it comes right back to me.
okay. So you and Linda are really prolific speakers on and writers, for that matter, on the issue of marriage, on how to make a marriage work, on raising children. Some of the books you've written they're outstanding. I haven't read all of them, so I'm not saying that they're not all great books, but the ones that I've read are really good. What I want to know
Well, thank you.
before we delve into the subject matter is, how did you get into this in the first place?
Well, this story will appeal to you, Paul, because I took a route that went through politics, which is not always the best route to take. we I went to Harvard Business School, and I went there not to learn business. I went there because I wanted to learn power. I wanted to, I'd had it in my mind since I was an undergrad that politics is where I wanted to go. And I worked for a guy way back when I was still in school. I worked for George Romney,
Oh
who
yeah,
is
ran for
Mitt
president, I
Romney's
believe.
father. Yeah, and George ran for president in 1968, and I was part of his team, and he became kind of a mentor to me. And I told him, I remember one night I said, George, I really want to follow your footsteps. I want to go into politics. So I want to go to Harvard Law School. And he said, why would you want to go to law school if you want to go into politics? He said, we've got way too many attorneys in politics. What politics needs is some managers, some administrators, some people who know how to do things. And that one night of advice changed me to want to go to Harvard Business School and to focus not on business, but on how politics and power and influence works. So I thought I had this track, right? And then a really interesting thing happened to Linda and I. We were called, I use that word because that's how we say it. We were asked by our church to volunteer for 3 years in London, running the church's affairs in the southern part of England, and including the administration of a bunch of full-time young missionaries. And it was an incredible experience, and it turned our lives in a lot of interesting directions, because one of the things we learned in that 3 years is that every one of these missionaries, these volunteers, these humanitarian young people, ideal workers, all of their assets and all their liabilities in each individual case could be traced back to their family. And the ones that were good because of how they'd been raised, and the ones that had issues got those issues growing up and through the way their parents parented them. And it just wore on us for 3 years, and we came back deciding that what we really wanted to do was impact families rather than governments. I mean, one way to say it is we had thought the way to change the world was through large institutions, the political institutions of our world. And we returned from those 3 years believing that the most basic institution of family is where the real changes occur. And so we started writing books and speaking, and our timing was good. People were ready for the kind of thing we were writing, and before we knew it, we were full-time writers and speakers, thinking we would never return to politics. Although, as you know, we did slip a little on that as the years went by.
Okay, so talk to me about this political thing for a moment. How do you find, or when you started being involved with Romney, and of course that's George Romney, Mitt's father, I believe. But
Right.
before you started writing books, you gained some type of political views, some idea of how power worked. Then you decide to go start focusing on the family. Did those thoughts still integrate, or did you find that there were bigger differences that you had after you learned so much about focusing on family and children and that type of thing, that maybe your earlier views might have been incorrect? I'd love to know how you reconciled that.
Well, a couple of things you should know in total candor. One of the problems we have in politics in this country, I think, Paul, is that the skill set that is required to get elected and the skill sets that are required to govern well or to legislate well or to do well in the office are completely different. And so we end up with people who have the political skill set and know how to get elected and know how to work that system, don't always have the skills that they're going to need when they get into office. And I would have been a prime example of that. Before this church calling came to us, I was, it's embarrassing. I hate to even admit this, but my goal, I thought it would be cool to be the youngest U.S. congressman. And I was 29 years old, and I was getting set up to run for Congress in our home state of Utah. And I had it all figured out. I would have been the youngest congressman out of 435. I thought that'll give me a platform. Everything will be great. And we had started a political consulting firm. We lived in Washington, D.C., but I went to Utah to run the Senate campaign of a man named Jake Garn, who was the mayor of Salt Lake and who wasn't given much chance to win, but we put together a good campaign, and he won an upset victory and got into the U.S. Senate, and it set me up as the campaign manager to run for that congressional seat the next year. And I was on the verge of running for that office and announcing my candidacy when we got this church calling. And I thank the Lord for that, because I would have been the prototypical example of someone who knew a whole lot about getting elected and about running a campaign and about working the system. But I would have been elected to Congress and I would have had no clue what my ideology or my goals were. My goal was power. My goal was to hold the office, and no one should ever run for office with those reasons in mind. So we felt like we were kind of saved by this church calling that took us out of politics, allowed us to see the world from a different angle, and to decide that, hey, if you really want to impact the world, you've got to do it in the basic institution of family. And so that's what we did. And our only other foray into politics was several years later when I ran for governor, and my whole issue was, let's make our state the most family centric state in the union. Let's build all of our policies around strengthening families, around empowering parents, around recognizing that it's parents who know what's best for their children, not government. And we had a good run. I won the Republican convention, but I lost in the runoff to a guy that had a lot more money than I did,
Oh yeah,
Paul.
money matters. Okay,
And you
so
know a lot about that. Speaking of youngest congressman, I think you were the youngest mayor of Phoenix. So
I was.
you probably had some of those same power thoughts back in your early
You
days.
know, I found what I found in my life, if I could give anybody a lesson from it, was before I went into office, I had a fundamental misunderstanding of how power worked. I
Yeah,
would have said that power goes to the people who are the strongest, who have the most money, who have the most might from any one of a variety of different standpoints. And I think what I found is that power is much different than oftentimes we perceive. As an example, in many ways, the things that you're doing has given you much more power than you might have had
yeah,
in even being governor. Much more
yeah,
power because your ability
yeah.
to effectuate change is higher. And second, what I found is, I always like to, I try to, when I'm teaching young people, I tell them the story of, think back 20,000 years ago, if we lived in tribes, what that might have been like.
Yeah,
And imagine the strongest guy in the tribe pulling in a buffalo and cutting up the buffalo and putting the pelt around his back and cutting up the food and feeding his family and everybody envying him. And then imagine another
right.
guy coming in who isn't as big, who isn't as strong, maybe didn't catch as big a buffalo, but he says, hey, first, he says, let's share this meat with the old people and the young people inside this village.
Mhm.
And then take this pelt over there to the people who are sick and make certain that they're warm. And whatever is left, give it to me. And then ask yourself the question, which one of those two do you think's really going to have more power? Right?
I love that, Paul. That's a great illustration. It makes me smile because while I was at Harvard, you had the opportunity as a student at the business school to, if you could find a professor who would go along with you, you could create a new course. And I was tired of the finance classes and the marketing classes and the production classes, and a friend of mine who was a French guy who, by the way, had the goal of becoming the president of France. That's never happened as far as I know, but we were there for the same reason. We found a professor who'd go along with us, and we started a course simply called Power. That was the name of the course. And the idea was to explore what power really was and how to obtain it. And it was an eye-opening experience because we came to a lot of the same conclusions you did, that power is not always obvious. It's not always the biggest and the strongest. It's not always the most visual or visible thing. It is how much change you actually effectuate. And a lot of times, very powerful people are very quiet people who are very clear in their own minds what their goal is, and who have found the right entry point, who found where it is that people can be influenced. And to your point, I mean, the timing of life is interesting. The very year after I ran and lost for governor in my state, one of our books, one called Teaching Your Children Values, caught Oprah's eye. And we ended up on the Oprah show and on Donahue and on Today and on a lot of shows. And suddenly we had a New York Times #1 bestseller. And I don't know if you think of that traditionally as power, but suddenly our influence over those who were reading and listening to what we were saying was much more widespread, and I think much more profound than if I'd been sitting in the state house, being the governor, cutting ribbons, going to parties, trying to work with legislators and so on. There might have been some visibility and it might have had the trappings of power, but if power doesn't change lives, is it real power?
What
And
value
I
is
would
it?
say no. Yeah.
You know, I do think like some of the postmodern movement today that has taken place, I think it comes from a misunderstanding of power. But to me, the real key in understanding how power works is a recognition that there are many people who do many great things. Our government, from the very beginning, if you just say, okay, I want to be an elected political leader and I'm going to have power, Well, our
Yeah.
government's done some great things. We built bridges and roads and schools, and we put a man on the moon, right? But at the end of the day, the greatest thing our government ever did was that it empowered the individual over itself. And if you
Yeah.
look at what really happens, it is the people who are outside of government that effectuate the most changes. I mean, if you think about who's going to create the driverless car, government, or
Right.
find a cure for cancer, or extend human life, or fix families. Those are
Right.
going to
Right.
be people who are in the private sector. We have empowered people so much in the private sector here in private life that that's where real power exists. In many ways, the people in politics, they're just trying to shuffle through our problems. They're trying to figure out how to adjust for the problems that we have. Their ability to make real advancements are lower. Now, the book I read was Teaching Children Joy. You just said Teaching Children Values. What was the difference between those two books?
Well, that's interesting. You read an earlier book then, Paul. The first parenting book we ever wrote was a book called the one you read, Teaching Children Joy, and the idea there was we felt like the mistake a lot of parents were making was they were trying to get their kids to be good rather than trying to help their kids to be happy. And so we wanted to turn that on its head and talk about how do you raise happy children and not forget responsibility and goodness and virtue and all that for a minute and just how do we make them happy? And it turned out that the two things run in parallel. And then a few years later, our editor at Simon and Schuster said, "Look, we want another book in this series, and whether you like the word joy or whether you like the word values, we know the market is for values. Parents want to know how to teach their children values." So we produced a sequel book called Teaching Your Children Values, which had a lot of the same principles, but used it in a little different way. And we were living in England at the time, not on our church assignment. We'd gone back to live there again, and we hit on the idea of having a book that didn't have chapters. We wanted it to have months, 12 months. And in January, we'll teach honesty. And in February, we'll teach courage. In March, we'll teach respect. And parents will focus only on one value every month. And this book will give you lots of methods for preschoolers, for elementary age kids, for teenagers. And it just hit a chord because parenting can get so complicated and parents thought, oh, wait, I only have to focus on one thing each month and I've got all of the methods that I need. I can do that. And they began to feel, it gets back to your point earlier, if you're going to help parents, it's not about telling them what to do, it's about making them feel empowered. Like I can actually do that. That's something I can do. And so that's the book that went to the top of the New York Times list, and that's the one Oprah liked, and so on. And it changed our scope of publishing. It got translated into a dozen languages. It started leading to speaking opportunities all over the world, and all because of the title. The title values just really reached people, and that put us on the map, so to speak, as authors. And believe it or not, other writers have a hard time imagining this, but when you have a New York Times #1 bestseller, it opens doors. And Simon and Schuster said, "Look, we want a 5-book contract with you and Linda, and you can write anything you want. The
Wow.
next 5 books you do, we will publish, and we're not going to tell you what they have to be about." And that was just like a golden that that was like a dream come true, and it changed. You, I'm going to put it in the vernacular you and I have been using. It gave us power, but I think the right kind of power. We now had an open door to try to teach people things we believed in, and we could write them and know that they were going to go to a lot of people in a lot of parts of the world. And we took that as a very, very heavy responsibility. We better be, it's not like writing a speculative book anymore. We're going to write a book that's going to be read by hundreds of thousands of people. We better be really sure that we believe what we say and that we've done the best thing we can with this, because we don't want to muff this opportunity.
That's awesome.
In other words, power is, far from being something to be coveted, it's something to be very, very careful with, right?
Absolutely.
We don't think of it that way quite often enough. It's a sacred responsibility.
Yeah, and it's, one of the things I found in being mayor, I found this to be interesting. I would have friends who, everybody would say, "Well, you changed," right? That would be immediately what happened. Of
Yeah,
course,
yeah.
I couldn't say to them, "Wow, I was kind of thinking you guys changed after I got power," right? But the key to it was that, I learned even getting a little bit mad at someone, just a normal conversation that anyone would
Yeah,
have where you'd say, "Oh, come on, you're crazy with that idea." That
yeah.
was taken so personal, and people would
Right,
immediately begin to shrink into their hole, and they would not fight back, or unless you said it in front of an audience, and then they'd almost want to attack you, because
right.
the sense of you having power was even greater than the power that you had. And it comes back to exactly what you're talking about. I think people misunderstand power. The real power, it's in each of us. It's in each of us to be able to make a difference in other people's lives. And then once you start to make a difference, you need to be really cautious how you're using that, because it can be misused easily.
Absolutely. And what you just said too, one of the problems of power or perceived power is getting other people to be real with you and to tell you what they really think and to take your opinion just as, hey, that's just my opinion, not to view your feedback as different because they perceive you to have power. And one of the problems for people who are perceived to have power is that people won't be candid with them. One of the politicians we used to work for said, I am so tired of being a person of power because I can't even get a straight answer. If I ask someone what time it is, they say whatever time you want it to be. And I just want to know what time it really is.
Yeah. Before I became mayor, I was an average guy. Once I became mayor, it was like I was a genius, and the reality was I was still just an average guy. But people begin to, everybody starts to agree with you, or they start to think that you have some special power. It's just not how democracy works. Okay, so I want to go back to kids for a moment. So when you talk about joy, values, responsibilities, is that, should you be teaching responsibilities to an 8-year-old, or should you be teaching joy to a 17-year-old? Is there a time difference in their lives?
That's a great question, Paul. That in our view, and people who have heard us speak really, really seem to resonate with this, that yeah, it is a progression, and our books ended up following that progression. We decided that when you have preschoolers, the goal is to teach them to be happy. That's the goal. That's what you're trying to do with preschoolers, is teach them the joy of the earth and the joy of their body and the joy of learning to tie their shoe. Put everything in the joy context, and you not only open their eyes and allow them to flourish, it's the best teaching method. Because if you can say, wow, you were so friendly with that person, how did that make you feel? Oh, I felt good. Good. Well, then do it again, because joy becomes not only the goal but the methodology. But then we decided that once you're in early elementary years, parents need to shift their focus and say, now it's time to teach responsibility. Now it's time to give you some jobs around the house. Now it's time to show you that there are consequences. It's time for you to be part of the solution, to be a working part, to have skin in the game within our family. And a lot of parents, of course, don't do that. They entitle their kids. They give them allowance. They give them everything, and they rob them of this chance of learning to have responsibility. Then we felt like when they become preteens or adolescents, the real trick is to try to teach them sensitivity or empathy, because at that age they begin, everything becomes a mirror to these kids when they're 13, 14, 15, and everything is perceived. How will that affect me? Should I be seen with that person? Is that a popular person? How does that come back in my mirror to me? And the idea of trying to teach them to see through windows instead, to see the other guy and who needs something and who you could help and so on. Very hard to do, but very important. And then finally, the capstone, the fourth book in the series, is the one on values, which really now goes back and pulls in the joy, the responsibility, the empathy, and tries to put it in a values context for the rest of their life. So it's a 4-book series, and it does follow the age and sort of priority in teaching each different age of children. And what it does, I think, I mean, uh, going back again to the definition of power as empowering others or helping others, it gives parents a track to run on. So much of parenting and so much of parenting books. If you go in a bookstore, and by the way, it's always shocking to me, Paul, how many parenting books there are. There's holes. You go in a big Barnes and Noble, there's 200 books on parenting
Yes.
on the shelf, and parents are confused about, well, which one do I want and which one will work for me. And the problem with most of them is they're defensive in nature. Their essential approach is, if Johnny has this problem, here's the solution, or if you're worried about this, here's the answer. And and humans don't operate as well on defense as on offense. So what we're trying to do is say, hey, here's the goal. The goal is to teach these young ones how to be happy. The goal is to teach the next ones how to be responsible. And here's some methods. And so if you empower parents with a goal and with some methods, they can get over saying, well, so and so has a problem, I've got to go look up how to solve the problem. You work on the offense of what the overall goal is, and some of the little problems you're worried about seem to go away because, hey, I've got a bigger goal. I know what the goal is with these children, and I'm working towards it despite the little problems that may come up along the way.
All right. So, as a parent that's raised a number of children, and I think I have 14 grandchildren. I also have a young 3-year-old. So I run the gamut. Here's
Wait a
my,
minute. You think you have 14? You better know that number,
you know,
brother.
okay. So so it's I don't count them every day, but I know that we just had a new baby, and I think that made the 14th grandchild. But nonetheless, you're right. I should know that, and I'll probably edit this show and cut that out so that I'm not in trouble when I go back. But
You better also know all their birthdays and a few other things about them.
the cell phone helps on that. But here's my question in watching them. The man, they're all different. How do you write to help a parent with children when in my experience they're so dramatically different sometimes that you can't even use the same techniques on one child that you might use on 4 others.
Well, and that you just hit the nail on the head. That's the other problem we have with most parenting books is they're sort of one size fits all, and anyone who's a parent or particularly a grandparent knows. I mean, I always smile because we talk to a lot of young parents and they're like, well, I just had my second child and I thought I figured it out on the first one. So I thought the second one was going to be easy. And guess what? Everything's different with this one,
Yeah.
And we say, well, get used to it because that'll be true of every single child. They're all different. And instead of giving you methods that'll work on everyone, let's try to give you methods to figure out this one child, who he is and what he's doing. One of the things we always try to get parents to do, especially if they're a 2-parent family and if they can brainstorm together. If they're a single parent, they need a grandparent or someone to do this with, but sit down on a regular basis and have what we call a 5-facet review of each child. So you've got little Josh here who you say to yourself, how's Josh doing physically? Let's really delve into that. Let's think about everything from his teeth to his hand-eye coordination to his I mean, let's really know him physically. What are his gifts? What are his liabilities? What's he good at? What's he not good at? Now, secondly, mentally, let's think about him mentally. How does he learn? Is he a verbal learner? Is he a audio learner? How does he learn? How does he not only how is he doing in school, but how does his brain work? And then third, how is he socially? Is he introverted? Is he extroverted? What are his friends like? We're the only experts here. No book is going to tell us about Josh. We've got to figure Josh out. And fourth, how is he emotionally? How are his moods? What do we know about him? And finally, fifth, how is he spiritually? Where's his heart? And parents, we try to say to parents, no, there's no parent expert on Josh. You're Josh's parents. You're the expert. You've got to take the time to figure out who this kid is. Think of little Josh as a jigsaw puzzle. You know some of the pieces. You got to find them all. You got to put that puzzle together, and then you'll know how to parent Josh. It won't be some expert who gives you some method or technique. It'll be you figured it out by thinking about that boy and who he really is. And by the way, it's also exciting, and it'll keep you from the horrible sort of pitfall that so many parents have of thinking, well, he's my son. He must be like me. I better try to make him what I thought I should have been, or what I wish, what would extend my ego. Or no, you got to figure out who this particular human is and what he needs from you as the steward over him. And if we can get parents to think like that, they don't need to read our parenting books. They just need to do their own thinking and their own praying about this one particular child.
So tell me if you look at the societal effects, we're talking about each child being different, but then we say things like, well, this is an entitled generation. Let's just use entitlement for a moment. Where does that come
Yeah.
from? Does it come from, are they born with it? Do the parents give it to them? Is society giving it to them? Is it a mixture of things? And how do you deal with trying to raise children so they don't feel entitled, so they're not entitled?
Well, again, it's back to trying to empower parents or people in general to think through their own individual issue rather than follow the crowd, rather than follow the norm, because the norm, using your example of entitlement, the norm is really bad. Parents tend to want to give their kids way too much. They tend to think that we read articles that say you better be careful if you have another child because it costs $582,000 to raise a child or whatever, and someone has figured out what it costs to go to an Ivy League school and so on, and they've intimidated parents. And we want to get parents instead to say, well, wait a second. If my goal is to teach this 10-year-old to be responsible, do I want to hand him $20 every week and say, here, this is your spending money? Or do I want to figure out a family economy where this child has some responsibility in the home and where we can say, hey, we're a family. There's certain things to do around this house. We have money coming in. Those who do the work should share in part of the money. And here's a family bank, and it'll pay interest to you if you leave your money in it. In other words, can we have a goal of creating a responsible child and think about how to get to that goal instead of saying, oh, well, everybody gives their kid an allowance and everybody buys all the things their kid needs and everybody takes all the responsibility for paying for college. Wait, am I sure I want to do that? Maybe there's a better way if I focus on what my goal is rather than what the larger society is doing.
Yeah, I listened to, I don't know if it was a podcast, but maybe it was one of your seminars. And I love this concept that you were talking about where, you have a talk with your children about saying you have a family bank. And with this family bank, we're going to open up the bank every Saturday and you're going to earn your money. And there are jobs that I'm doing that I don't want to do anymore. One of the jobs that I don't want to do anymore is the job of waking you up and making certain that you're getting your breakfast eaten. And one of the jobs I don't want to do is telling you come home and do your homework. And one of the jobs I don't want to do anymore is putting you to bed. And then you had these sign-offs where they would sign off on doing each of those tasks, and at the end of the week you'd then distribute the money based upon how well they did, which had to be interesting if you had a bunch of kids like you did. But nonetheless, you could see where they were, instead of getting an allowance, they were earning in. They were taking some of their responsibilities and having it being treated like a job, which gave them ownership.
Yeah, that the whole key is ownership. You're right on, Paul. And we some of the best letters we've had from parents are sort of their own awakening. I mean, I remember one that said, "Hey, it just finally occurred to me that every Saturday was like we just opened the welfare window. You know, the kids are lined up, give us our money, give us our money, and we're handing them money." And he said when we changed the model so we didn't have allowance, we had payday on Saturday. The bank is open now. You've kept track of whether you did your responsibility each day. How much you get is exactly proportionate to how much you did. And you see these little kids and the lights going on, and it's the most basic light of all, that performance is connected to reward, something they had never imagined until that moment, you know. So these basic lessons that we can learn, and part of it is, I mean, you know, if you're going to give a kid that kind of responsibility, you better also give him purchase responsibility. You better not have him earn money and then continue to buy him everything he needs. You better say, now, you know, next time you ask me for something, I'm going to say, well, let's see how much money's in the bank. Have you got enough to buy it? Well, no, I don't. Well, how long will it take you to save up enough to buy that? Well, it'll take me too long. And then maybe the kid becomes a negotiator. Maybe he says, well, I need those new shoes in time for basketball. How about if I save up half? Will you match it, Dad? I mean, you're in the real world now, and maybe you're the dad, and you say, you know, I think I will. I think that's great if you can save up half, because all you want is you know, he could pay. We had another letter I'm thinking about the other day from someone who said, we decided that our bank, our family bank, would pay high interest. And I, you know, was curious about how much. And he said, well, you're not going to believe it, but it pays 10% every quarter. I said, wow, that is high interest. And he said, well, but there's a caveat. The money that they earn interest on is to go toward their college education. Now, this is money these kids have earned. They're now saving it in a family bank. They're getting paid interest on it, but all of it is now perceived as theirs. That's my money. I earned it. I saved it. It belongs to me. And he said, we decided way back when this particular child was 14 that she would pay 20% of her college tuition. And so he said, when I took her to the bursar's office and she got out her little checkbook that she had in a real bank, and she wrote out this check, and she looked up at me and she said, Dad, that's a lot of money. And he said, I wanted to tell her, well, you see the 80% I have to write out now. But he said, I just listened to her, and the next sentence was, I am gonna, I am really gonna work hard. This is an expensive education. I am gonna do my best. And he said, I realized it's the ownership. You know, if that kid's going to school and doesn't even know how much the tuition is because the parents pay it all, think of the difference in motivation between someone who's saved for 5 years, paid part of their own tuition, and now they're saying, I'm gonna get all I can out of that expensive education.
By the way, one of the things that I heard Linda say that I thought was wonderful, I wish I would have had it when my boys were growing up, but she said, don't let them buy the entire phone. They can only buy 49% of the phone.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh yeah. You want to retain control of certain things.
Yeah,
I own 51% of your phone. It will not be in your room at night.
that is so much a business school lesson, though. You have to admit that stems back to your business teaching and learning. All right,
Right.
so here's a question that I've struggled with oftentimes personally. You know, your children become such a priority in your life. How do you balance that out with your marriage? How do you balance that out to make certain that you're giving the right amount of time to your spouse as well as to your children?
Boy, that's a powerful question. We sometimes start out some of our lectures by asking that question. We just put it to parents bluntly. We say, look, if you had to tell us right now how much mental energy and effort you're putting into your parenting and into your marriage, which one's getting the most? Which one's getting the most priority and mental energy? 95% of parents say it's the parenting. That's what we're working the hardest on. That's what we're worrying about the most. And then the next question we ask them is that a problem that you're putting more effort into the parenting than in the marriage? And virtually all of them say yes, that is a problem, because you don't have to tell them that as goes the marriage, so will go the parenting. And by the way, it's not the other way around. We run into so many couples who are really killing it as parents. I mean, they're just doing everything they can. They're conscientious. They're working hard at it. And it does not necessarily impact their marriages favorably. In fact, sometimes it works against it because they're pulled in two different directions with the children. But in every case, an improving marriage is going to improve how the kids' sense of well-being and how the kids are doing. So it's funny, in our case, we had written, I think, a dozen parenting books, Paul, and our publisher, after almost every one, would say, well, when are you going to do the marriage book? When are you going to do the marriage book? You're just doing parenting. And we're like, well, when we figure it out, we'll write a book. And finally, we've done one marriage book, and ironically, it's called The Eight Myths of Marriage. In other words, we felt like we were pretty good at writing about what you shouldn't do in marriage. And it is a lifetime process, but
What are the big myths?
we all need to examine, well, the clone myth, for example, that marriages are best when there's no disagreement, when people agree on everything, or the myth that marriages are falling apart. There's no good marriages anymore, and actually, some of the best marriages in the world. Marriages are better today, Paul, than they were back in the 50s, when we think, oh, everyone stayed married then, it was all great. Marriages were lousy then compared to the marriages we have now, because they're more today. The good marriages are more equal. They're more respectful. They're more real partnerships. And so, we just tried to explore all that. But you made the main point. The main thing people should think about is just that question: am I putting as much effort and creativity and thought into my marriage as I am into my parenting? And if the answer is no, that's a warning. And and it's for the good of your kids too. I still remember one time with my most emotional little daughter. I was telling her how much I loved her as I put her to bed one night, and I said, "Shawnee, I just love you so much. You can't even know how much I love you." And she, in her little 5-year-old way, said, "You love me more than anyone, don't you, Daddy?" And without thinking, I said, "Well, Shawnee, I actually love Mom a little bit more than I love you." And she burst into tears. She was just devastated. "You love someone more than me." But it's become a joke to us, because in years after, one of the things she has always said is the most important security I ever had is when you told me that you loved Mom more than me. And I
That's
think
wonderful.
that's what kids need to know.
Yeah.
That gives them a security that now you don't go too far. We run into a lot of parents who'll say, "Well, I've got to be sure my children never see me fight or disagree or have any sort of tension between us." And that's just a disaster, because then your kids will grow up thinking that's how their marriage will be, and it never will be, and just as yours never was. And so we try to teach parents that it's okay for kids to see you disagree, but they've got to see you also reconcile. They've got to see you also make up. They've got to see you also come together and compromise. That's the lessons you will teach them through your relationship.
All right. So you talk about diversity being a problem. I find that interesting. Can you tell me what that means?
Well, you're probably referring, the latest book I did is a book called No Divisions Among You, and it's a book about how divided our society. It started out, Paul, as a book about political division
Hmm.
and about how polarized we're becoming as a country. And I do think we're more polarized by far than we've ever been before. And I think it's affected everything. And but the further I got in writing, and I actually was editing it, we had several writers contributing essays on unity and how to get past some of the polarizing that's going on. And the more I did and the more they did, the more we realize it's far more basic than politics. It's not, I mean, in a way, politics thrives on division. I mean, that's why we have a two-party system. Politics thrives on strong opinions coming together and theoretically compromising and coming to solutions, although that's not happening very much. But we decided in writing the book that where the real problem is the division in much more basic institutions, the divisions in our church congregations, the divisions in our families, and the people who don't talk to their brother or sister anymore because they get their news from a different news source or cable channel, or they believe in a different political ideology. And trying to learn how to embrace diversity, it turns out I thought this is a departure for me. This is a book on something other than family. Turns out it's exactly on family, because within families, within the most basic institution, we need to learn to accept and welcome different opinions, different approaches, different modes of operation. And only when we do can we begin to learn and expand. When we're in this pattern that we see so much in politics, that my way's the right way, therefore you are wrong, we're just headed down. We're headed over Niagara Falls. And
So the
I go back to my political experience. I worked in the Senate as an intern when I was 21 years old, and the senators that I admired most were the kind that don't exist anymore. They were moderates. Moderate's a dirty word now in both parties. If
Mhm.
you're a moderate, you've sold out. The ones I admired were, I could mention names. You'd remember Everett
Oh,
Dirksen and
yes.
Charles Percy and Mac Mathias and
Wow.
Edward Brooke. I mean, these guys knew how to pull diversity together and create a solution. Where are those people today?
So the connection that I made to you talking about diversity, it tied back to family as well. And here's how I saw that. If you have a husband and a wife who, one does a very good job of focusing on the future and making money and taking care of the economics of the family, and the other one does a
Right,
great job of taking care of the emotional needs of people in the family and taking care of making certain that people feel like they're important. Even though both can help on the other task, the idea that you
right.
have two different people doing two different things is not a bad thing. It can be a very,
No,
very good thing.
powerful,
And
powerful thing.
what happens in society is oftentimes we fail to recognize there are values to conservatives and to liberals. For the most part, liberals tend to think about possibilities, new things that we might be able to create.
Good point. Good
Conservatives
point.
tend to think very much about, hey, let's be careful we don't lose all the great things that we have. Let's make certain that we're doing what we need to protect them. I think they're both necessary. I mean, I couldn't
Oh,
imagine this country without Jefferson and Hamilton. Both of them were on two
yeah,
diverse points of view, but they
yeah.
were they were both necessary. And what we've begun to do is we've lost the ability to think about the value that the other person is bringing to the table. And then we start these labels, right? We say, well,
Yeah,
and you could do
yeah,
this with your spouse. You could say, well, my husband's a jerk, or my wife is some word that I probably shouldn't use on
yeah.
air. But when you do that and you create that label, Now, all of a sudden, you've objectified them. And once you've objectified them, there's no way that they can penetrate and find any way to get back into your good graces because you have this label for them. Until you see them as people again, that have all the same challenges that you have, that have all the same insecurities that you have, the troubles of communicating that you have, then you can't really reconcile. And that to me is true in society as well. If we would just drop the labels and try to see one another as people, our odds go way up of being able to work with one another.
Well, and your odds of expanding your own horizons and your own perspectives and becoming a broader minded, more empathetic person take off. And one of the things I think we're trying to say in this book is that diversity is not a bad thing, and even disagreement is not a bad thing, and sometimes even dissension is not a bad thing, but or not always a bad thing. But when it gets to disrespect and to dismissal, it becomes a very, very bad thing. I
Disrespect and
opened the
dismissal.
book with a story that a friend told me that really struck me because it's so simple. She said, a new person moved into our neighborhood and I met them at church and I was so impressed. They're a young couple and I was really impressed. And I thought, I'm going to bring them over a loaf of bread and just go to their house and get to know them because I'm so impressed. And she got her bread and she drove over there and she saw a yard sign in their front yard for a candidate that she just despised. And Paul, instead of stopping and going in and focusing on the good things and delivering the bread and getting to know these people, she just drove right on by that house and went back home and ate the bread herself and said, I'm not going to have anything to do with those people if they're going to vote for that candidate. And then a couple days later, she was in a reflective mood and she thought, what in the world is wrong with me? I let one yard sign change my opinion of these people and cause me to judge them. What kind of a bigot am I to think that I can make that sort of judgment? And she said, for the first time, I realized I'm part of the problem. She said, I thought of myself as an open minded sort of person. I see the problem in our society, but I'm not part of that polarization. And suddenly boy, am I ever. I'm the heart of it because I made that kind of judgment. And so, yeah, to be able to get to the point where we can say, you know, I'm really interested in your view on this or that, and I'd like I'd like you to teach me about it. I'd like you I'd like to understand why you feel that way and to really mean it, not as an argumentative technique, but it would expand me if I understood why you feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
Then we're on a level where we're learning and we're teaching, and 99% of the time, that other person, after he finishes explaining his view, will say, I'd kind of like to know how you feel about it. And now you're having a real discussion.
Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that this journey of your life and watching it or standing back and seeing it from afar starts with power and politics. It moves its way into the family. It figures out how to deal with dissension and diversity amongst family members, spouses, and others. And you're right back to teaching it to the rest of us in terms of our politics and how we might get better, not just in our families, but in our society.
Well, I don't know if we ever teach anything, but if we share what we're learning, maybe some people will learn from that. It's all about asking the best question, isn't it? In fact, I remember one time a parent came and said, all right, you've written all these books. What is the bottom line? What's the one thing? Which in a way is the worst question in the world. In fact, when you're an author and you're being interviewed on media, you can always tell the hosts who've read your book from the ones who are just sort of doing their job as an interviewer,
Uh-huh.
because the ones who haven't read it, their first question is always, Well, Mr. Eyre, can you kind of tell me what the bottom line of your book is?
Boy, I'll tell you what, if you could give me a bottom line on marriage, I'll take it. In fact, I'll pay for it right now. I'll send in a check.
And once in a while, when I've been in a contrary mood, and some know nothing host asks me that, I'm like, it would really be interesting to me if you told me, what do you think the bottom line of my book was? Then you're off to a really bad interview.
By the
But
way, I have to say this on your website. I've looked at a lot of websites for a variety of different reasons. One for our podcast, but also just because of the business that I'm in. We'll always do research on people that we're trying to sell to or that type
sure,
of thing. I
sure.
own a healthcare company. Your website gave away more for free than you could almost possibly imagine. I mean, it was what it said to me was that your real value in life is helping people.
Well, that's kind of you, Paul. Maybe you came to the part of this is a strange goal for an author to have, but Linda and I would like, as we move into our senior years, our dream would be to have every book we've ever written be free and just be there online and not even have to go through some process to download it. We'd like it to be there on the website. One click, you read the book, you read whatever part of it you want. And we're getting there. We've now gotten more than half of our books are just there. It's called Eyre's Free Books. You just go and read them. There's some we can't do that yet with because the publishers still have the full copyright rights and so on. But you're right. I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could all have an attitude? And I think this comes later in life, right? I mean, books have been very, very good to us financially. Why would we want them to continue to be restricted, right? Why not say, hey, if you want the book, it's yours? But I think what I was getting to earlier, the bottom line, the answer I ended up giving to this parent who said, if there's one thing that I can do for my kids above all others, it just sort of occurred to me at that moment, if you can teach your child to ask good questions,
Mm.
that's probably the greatest gift you'll ever give, because that'll lead to empathy. That'll lead to more education. That'll lead to sort of focusing on the other person instead of yourself. That will lead to um, respect, because you always, the more you know about some, I mean, I'm sure there's some people, the more you know about them, the less you respect them. But in general terms, the more you can ask, the more you end up liking the person. You may not admire them, but you'll end up understanding them better and liking them. So we all need to teach ourselves to ask better questions. You're good at it. That's why you enjoy interviewing and doing podcasts. You have figured out that the most interesting conversation is when you ask a good question.
Mm-hmm.
And you might even get an answer that surprises you, and you might learn from that, or you might develop a different opinion. But everything starts with a good question. And we live in this world where answers are so cheap. I mean, I can Google anything, I can find an answer in a second, and they're just everywhere. And we can't even distinguish which are true anymore. There's so many answers. But a good question, that's the beauty. That's the thing most people can't do. And I think kids are brilliant at it if we encourage them. We've all seen a 5-year-old who's so curious that he just asks good questions. And then as he gets a little older and he thinks more about himself and his ego starts to come out, he forgets how to ask questions. And we need to teach ourselves and teach our children, and within our marriages, within our churches, within our communities, ask the good question.
Yeah, that is wonderful advice, and something that I mean, what I love about my podcast, the same thing I love about your books, right? For you, I pay you 14 bucks or whoever, Amazon $14, and I get the best of your thinking, right?
Yeah,
Now a
yeah.
podcast is even better. I get people to come on my shows, and I get to learn an amazing amount from them. And Richard, you and Linda have an amazing amount of wealth to share with the public. I just can't tell you how much I appreciate you guys being in the world. That's awesome.
Well, you're so kind, Paul, and I do love the age we live in of websites because and by the way, we get a lot of experts telling us, hey, number one, your website's way too complicated. Number two, it has way too much that's for free. And number three, it has to sort of suck people in and then get them to go here or there. And that's just not our view at all. And as you know, the sort of parent website is, and when I say parent, I mean it's the umbrella for everything we do, is called valuesparenting.com. Now, there's a website called the Eyres.com, and there's one we're really excited about right now called Grandparenting 101.
I'm
I want to
getting that
get
one.
you on that one.
I'll be on that one.
Grandparenting 101. But you can get to all of them from valuesparenting.com. And we love websites not only because it gives us a chance to throw a lot out there, we get a lot of feedback from it. And we always love it when people say, here's what I liked, here's what I didn't like, here's what I still don't understand, because it opens that dialogue back and forth.
You know, I will put up on this the section of your website that I liked when we're doing our edits on the show. But
Great.
I love the fact that you did bullet points. And I'm going to say you can see the bullet points here because those are going to be on the site.
Right.
All right, Richard, thank you so much for coming on. If people do want to contact you or be able to get through to you, would you repeat those websites again?
I'll just repeat the one because they can branch to everything else from there. Valuesparenting.com, all strung together, no spaces. Valuesparenting.com.
Richard, thank you so much for being on The Optimistic American.
Real pleasure, Paul. Do all you can to keep us optimistic. I think there's more pessimism in the world today than I've ever seen, and you're a force in the opposite direction.
Oh, right back to you and Linda. And also tell Linda thank you for all the work that she's done.
I will indeed. Thanks so much. Okay, brother. Great to talk to you, and all the best.
Thank you. Thanks for joining the Optimistic American Show. Now help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned. We can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.